In this episode, we move into a lesson that sounds administrative at first, but is actually one of the clearest signs that an organization is taking artificial intelligence, AI, governance seriously. When companies begin using AI, many of them act as if they need one new policy labeled AI and little else, but that usually misses the deeper problem. AI changes how information is collected, interpreted, generated, shared, stored, and relied upon, which means older policies written for ordinary software often stop being complete even if they still sound fine on paper. Privacy rules may not fully address prompts and generated outputs. Security rules may not anticipate data leakage through external tools. Data governance rules may not explain how training and inference data should be tracked. And intellectual property, IP, rules may not account for generated text, code, images, or reused source material. The central idea of this lesson is that responsible AI use does not sit beside the old policy framework like a new decorative sign. It forces the organization to revisit the core rules it already has and make them strong enough to govern how AI actually behaves in real work. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is understanding why updating existing policies matters more than writing one short standalone AI statement full of broad promises. Older privacy, security, data, and IP policies were often built around systems that were more predictable, less generative, and less dependent on large-scale data use and pattern recognition. Those policies may assume that employees know exactly what information goes into a system, what comes out, and where it is stored afterward. AI makes those assumptions less reliable because inputs can contain sensitive context, outputs can reveal or infer more than expected, and systems may be built, fine-tuned, or operated by third parties in ways that blur traditional boundaries. When an organization fails to update the older policy stack, it often ends up with two bad results at the same time. The AI policy sounds modern and responsible, but the everyday rules people actually follow remain outdated, which means the organization creates a surface appearance of governance without fixing the deeper operating rules that shape real decisions. Privacy is often the first policy area that needs serious updating because AI expands the ways personal information can be gathered, inferred, combined, and reused. In ordinary software settings, a privacy policy may focus heavily on collection, storage, sharing, and retention, but AI adds questions about training data, prompt content, generated summaries, behavioral patterns, and the possibility that a system can infer sensitive details that were never explicitly provided in neat fields. A person may enter what seems like harmless context into an AI tool and unintentionally include customer details, employee issues, medical facts, legal concerns, or internal performance data. The tool may then process that information in ways the user does not understand, or the vendor may handle it in ways the organization has not examined closely enough. Updating privacy policy for AI, therefore, means going beyond basic statements about confidentiality and access. It means clearly defining what kinds of personal information may be used with AI systems, for what purposes, under what approvals, with what notice, and with what restrictions on reuse, retention, training, and disclosure. A stronger privacy policy also has to address the fact that AI systems can create new information about people, not just store the information they were given. This matters because privacy risk is not limited to obvious inputs like names, email addresses, or account numbers. A model may infer likely behavior, probable interests, risk levels, emotional states, or other personal characteristics based on patterns in the data, and those inferences can become part of how people are treated even if the organization never intended to create a formal profile. That means an updated privacy policy should speak clearly about purpose limits, data minimization, role-based access, and the difference between information that is useful and information that is justified. It should also explain when human review is required for higher impact uses and when personal data should be excluded from prompts, testing, or experimentation altogether. Privacy policy becomes much more useful when it recognizes that AI changes not only the volume of information involved, but also the meaning that can be extracted from that information, which is exactly why old privacy language often needs more than a light edit. Security policy needs the same kind of refresh because AI introduces new pathways for exposure, misuse, and overtrust that ordinary software rules may not address well enough. Many organizations already have rules about passwords, access control, remote work, data sharing, and incident reporting, but those rules may not say enough about what happens when employees paste internal material into external AI tools, rely on generated code without sufficient review, or connect third-party systems to important data sources. AI can increase efficiency, but it can also increase the speed at which confidential information is mishandled or the scale at which poor decisions spread. A weakly governed tool can leak internal knowledge, encourage staff to lower their guard, or make malicious activity more effective through better impersonation, better text generation, or easier automation of harmful tasks. Updating security policy for AI means making clear what tools are approved, what categories of information are restricted, what technical controls must exist, what logging or monitoring expectations apply, and what kinds of outputs require validation before they are trusted in technical, operational, or business settings. That updated security policy should also account for the fact that AI systems change over time in ways that traditional software policies may not fully anticipate. A normal business application might receive patches and feature updates, but many AI tools can change behavior in more subtle ways through model updates, vendor changes, new integrations, altered prompts, different user practices, or expanded data access. If the security policy does not require change review, scope permissions, testing in sensitive environments, and clear escalation for unusual behavior, the organization may discover too late that the tool no longer behaves as originally approved. Security policy should therefore include expectations for environment separation, least privilege access, secure integration design, misuse detection, and incident response paths specific enough to cover AI-related problems. It should also make it clear that helpful output is not the same as trustworthy output. Security incidents involving AI will not always look like classic break-ins. Sometimes the problem will be data leakage, unsafe automation, manipulated inputs, unreviewed code, or users following generated advice with more confidence than the system deserves. Data governance is another area where organizations often underestimate how much updating is needed. In many companies, data governance policy existed long before AI and focused on topics like ownership, quality, retention, classification, and approved business use. Those topics still matter, but AI puts them under more pressure because the system's behavior depends so heavily on data source quality, suitability, lineage, and ongoing relevance. A dataset that is good enough for reporting may not be good enough for model training. A data source that is technically accessible may not be appropriate for prompting or fine-tuning. A label that was once good enough for broad analytics may be too weak for a system that helps shape decisions about people, money, safety, or opportunity. Updating data governance policy for AI means teaching the organization to ask not only whether the data exists, but whether it is representative, current, understandable, legally and ethically appropriate, and traceable enough to support later review when questions arise about how the system reached certain kinds of outputs. A good AI-aware data governance policy should also require stronger documentation around where data came from, how it was prepared, who approved its use, what limitations were known, and when that approval must be revisited. Without those records, organizations often forget why a dataset was considered acceptable and later reuse it in settings that carry higher stakes or different affected populations. Versioning becomes more important as well, because even small changes in data sources or filtering decisions can influence outputs in ways that matter for fairness, privacy, safety, or explainability. Data governance should also address the difference between training data, testing data, operational input data, and output records, because those categories do not all raise the same issues even when they relate to the same system. Strong policy in this area helps teams avoid the lazy assumption that all usable data is equally acceptable data. Once AI enters the picture, that assumption becomes dangerous because the system may amplify weaknesses in provenance, quality, or context that once seemed minor in less consequential applications. IP policy is the fourth major area that needs updating, and it is one that many beginners do not think about until the organization has already started generating content, code, summaries, or designs through AI tools. Traditional IP policy may talk about ownership of employee work, use of licensed materials, protection of trade secrets, and restrictions on copying outside content, but AI complicates each of those topics. If employees use external tools to generate marketing text, software code, visual assets, or research summaries, the organization needs clear rules on review, attribution, originality checks, and what can be published or shipped without human examination. The company also needs to think carefully about whether internal confidential information is being placed into systems in ways that might weaken trade secret protection or violate contracts. Updating IP policy for AI means recognizing that the output may look original while still carrying legal, ethical, or business questions about source material, ownership assumptions, or permitted use. It also means teaching people that generated material is not automatically safe to treat as fully owned simply because a machine produced it. A more mature IP policy will go further and address how AI is used both to create new material and to transform or analyze existing material. An employee might ask an AI system to rewrite a draft, summarize third-party content, suggest software routines, generate training materials, or create an image based on an internal product concept. Each of those uses can raise different IP issues depending on the data provided to the system, the licensing or contractual terms around the tool, and the intended downstream use of the output. If the policy does not explain when legal review is needed, when vendor terms must be examined, when generated code requires extra scrutiny, or when employees should avoid using AI on sensitive creative work altogether, the organization may accidentally weaken its own rights while exposing itself to disputes over someone else's material. IP policy for AI should therefore be practical rather than abstract. It should tell people how to handle prompts containing proprietary material, what kinds of review must happen before publication or product use, and when the safest answer is to keep certain work outside external systems entirely. One of the most important things beginners need to understand is that these four policy areas do not operate as separate islands. Privacy, security, data governance, and IP issues often show up together in the same use case, and updating one policy without updating the others can leave serious gaps. Imagine an employee using an external AI assistant to summarize customer complaints. That one act could involve personal data, internal security exposure, uncertain retention practices, and possibly confidential product information or protected internal know-how. If privacy policy says be careful with personal information, but security policy does not define approved tools, data governance does not classify the complaint data correctly, and IP policy does not address confidential business context, then the organization has not really governed the use. It has merely scattered partial rules across different documents. A stronger policy framework helps teams see connected risk instead of isolated checkboxes. That matters because AI often combines speed, scale, and ambiguity in a way that causes one weak decision to create several types of policy failure at once. This is why many organizations also need an updated acceptable use layer that connects the policy framework to real employee behavior. People do not operate by reading 4 long policy documents every time they use a tool. They rely on simple rules, shared norms, approved workflows, and training that translates policy into everyday judgment. An acceptable use update for AI should explain what kinds of tools are approved, what data categories are restricted, when escalation is required, when human review is mandatory, and what kinds of content should never be trusted without verification. It should also clarify that not all AI use is equal. A low-risk internal drafting task is not the same as using generated output in a contract, a hiring process, a customer decision, or production code. The acceptable use layer matters because it turns general policy into operational guidance. Without it, employees may want to follow the rules, but still make poor choices simply because the organization never translated high-level policy language into plain expectations that fit real work. Training and role clarity are just as important as the policy text itself. A privacy professional, security leader, data steward, procurement manager, developer, and everyday employee all need somewhat different guidance if the updated policy stack is going to work in practice. Leaders need to know when approval and escalation are required. Technical teams need to know what information they can use, what documentation they must create, and what validations are expected before deployment. Employees need to know what they can enter into tools, what output they can rely on, and when they must pause and ask for help. Procurement and vendor teams need to understand what terms, controls, and disclosures matter before a new tool is adopted. Policy updates fail when they are treated as static text rather than as part of a wider operating model. Once AI enters the organization, policies only become real when responsibilities, workflows, training, and oversight all reinforce the same message about how privacy, security, data governance, and IP protections are supposed to function in actual use. There are also a few common misconceptions that good policy updates should correct directly. One misconception is that a general warning not to enter sensitive information into public tools solves the whole problem. That is too narrow because AI risk also comes from internal tools, vendor integrations, generated outputs, inferred information, and quiet expansion of use cases over time. Another misconception is that if a vendor says customer data is protected, the organization can stop worrying. Vendors matter, but deployment decisions, user behavior, and internal workflows still create responsibility that cannot be outsourced away. A third misconception is that generated output belongs entirely to the organization without question. That assumption may prove careless if the tool terms, source material, or intended use create legal or business complications. The best policy updates, therefore, do more than prohibit obvious mistakes. They correct the false sense that older rules or vendor promises automatically cover the new ways AI interacts with information, systems, and valuable internal assets. As you finish this lesson, keep one main idea in mind. Responsible AI governance does not mean past policy areas become less important. It means those policy areas become more interconnected, more operational, and more demanding because AI changes how information flows and how decisions are made. Privacy policy must address new forms of input, inference, and reuse. Security policy must address new forms of exposure, misuse, and overtrust. Data governance policy must address provenance, suitability, and traceability with much more discipline. IP policy must address generation, transformation, confidentiality, and review with much more clarity. When organizations update these policies together, they create a stronger foundation for real governance because the rules people follow every day begin to match the realities of how AI tools are actually used. That is what makes policy modernization so important. It is not paperwork for its own sake. It is the work of making the organization's core protections fit the technology it has chosen to bring into its operations.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.